What if losing everything you've ever worked for could be the greatest gift life ever gives you? This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a man who discovered that sometimes you have to fall to your knees before you can truly learn to stand. His journey from the pinnacle of Wall Street success to the depths of homeless shelters, and then to something far more meaningful than he ever imagined, will forever change how you see failure, success, and what it truly means to be human. The morning sun painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of amber and gold as Marcus Thompson stood behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building. At 35 years old, he commanded one of the most coveted positions in American finance as the youngest vice president in the 127-year history of Sterling and Associates, one of Wall Street's most prestigious investment firms. The city sprawled beneath him like a conquered kingdom, every glittering skyscraper a testament to the empire he had built through sheer force of will and relentless ambition. His reflection in the window showed a man who had seemingly achieved the American dream in its most extravagant form. The custom-tailored Armani suit, crafted by a Milan artisan who knew his measurements by heart, fitted his lean frame like liquid shadow. His platinum Rolex Submariner caught the morning light with each gesture, a $40,000 reminder of time conquered and monetized. His Italian leather shoes, handcrafted by a cobbler whose waiting list stretched 2 years, clicked authoritatively against the marble floors that had been imported from the same quarries that supplied the Vatican. But Marcus Thompson hadn't always inhabited this rarefied world of unlimited expense accounts and corporate jets. He was born Marcus Eugene Thompson in Highland Park, Michigan, a working-class neighborhood in Detroit, where his father, Eugene Thompson Sr., spent 33 years on the assembly line at the Ford Rouge plant, and his mother, Dorothy Mae Thompson, served lunch to elementary school children for 28 years. The Thompson family lived in a modest 2-bedroom house with aluminum siding and a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of Michigan winters. Young Marcus had been different from the other kids in his neighborhood from the very beginning. While his friends played basketball on cracked asphalt courts and dreamed of athletic scholarships, Marcus spent his afternoons in the Detroit Public Library, devouring books about business, economics, and the lives of great financiers. He would sit at the same scarred wooden table every day after school, surrounded by volumes that transported him far from the sounds of factory shifts changing and unemployment lines growing longer. His grandmother, Essie Mae Washington, who lived with the family after his grandfather passed away, would often find him at the kitchen table late at night, studying by the light of a small desk lamp while she counted grocery store coupons and planned meals that could stretch $1 into a feast for 5 people. She would place a gentle hand on his shoulder and say in her soft Alabama drawl, "Baby, you got something special in that head of yours, but don't you ever forget where you come from. All the book learning in the world ain't worth nothing if you lose sight of who you are." Marcus had earned a full academic scholarship to the University of Michigan, where he majored in economics and finance while working 20 hours a week at a campus bookstore to pay for textbooks and personal expenses. His professors quickly recognized his exceptional analytical abilities and his hunger for success that burned like a pilot light, never extinguishing, always ready to ignite into something larger. After graduation, he had been accepted to the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, where he completed his MBA in the top 5% of his class. His thesis on derivative market inefficiencies had been published in the Journal of Financial Economics and caught the attention of recruiters from the most elite firms on Wall Street. Sterling and Associates had offered him a starting position as a junior analyst with a salary that was more than his parents had ever earned combined. Marcus threw himself into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, routinely working 18-hour days, sleeping in his office when necessary, and treating every assignment as if his entire future depended on its success. Within 5 years, he had been promoted to associate. Within 8 years, senior associate. By his 10th year, he was a vice president managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His colleagues began calling him the alchemist behind his back, a nickname that carried equal measures of admiration and resentment, because of his seemingly magical ability to transform failing investments into streams of liquid gold. But success, Marcus discovered, was a drug that required increasingly larger doses to maintain the same high. The modest apartment in Queens had been replaced by a penthouse overlooking Central Park. The subway commute had been replaced by a Maserati Gran Turismo that he drove with the windows down through the canyons of Manhattan, its engine roaring like a declaration of victory. The dinner dates at neighborhood pizza joints had been replaced by reservations at restaurants where the wine list required its own sommelier, and where being recognized by the maître d' was a mark of social arrival. He dated Vivian Ashworth, a model and aspiring actress whose primary occupation seemed to be looking beautiful at charity galas and posting carefully curated images of her luxury lifestyle on Instagram. She was 28 years old, possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that stopped conversations in crowded rooms, and had never worked a day in her life. Their relationship was built on mutual benefit, rather than mutual affection. She provided him with arm candy that enhanced his image of success, and he provided her with access to the lifestyle she felt she deserved. Marcus's transformation from the humble kid who helped his grandmother count coupons to the man who now tipped restaurant servers based on how quickly they recognized his importance had been so gradual that he barely noticed it happening. Success had changed him in ways both visible and invisible, creating a version of himself that his younger self might not have recognized or respected. His philosophy of life had crystallized into a simple but ruthless principle. Weakness was failure, and failure was unacceptable. He had built his entire identity on being superior to others, on never showing vulnerability, on always being the smartest, richest, most successful person in any room he entered. Humility, in his worldview, was just another word for settling for mediocrity, for accepting less than what you deserved, for allowing others to take what was rightfully yours. This Tuesday morning had started like hundreds of others. Marcus arrived at his office at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before most of his colleagues, and immediately began reviewing overnight reports from Asian markets and European trading sessions. He screamed at junior analysts who dared to question his projections, sent emails written in the kind of corporate language designed to intimidate rather than communicate, and closed a merger deal that would net him a 7-figure bonus by Christmas. He was scheduled to ring the closing bell at the New York Stock Exchange the following Friday, an honor reserved for the most successful players in American finance. The invitation had been framed and hung on his office wall next to his MBA diploma, and a photograph of him shaking hands with the Treasury Secretary at a White House reception. The intercom on his desk buzzed with the voice of his assistant, Patricia Chen, whose efficiency and discretion had made her indispensable to his operation. "Mr. Thompson, Sarah Chen from Compliance is here to see you. She says it's urgent." Marcus glanced at his Rolex, 10:47 a.m., and calculated how this interruption would affect his carefully orchestrated schedule. "Send her in, but tell her I only have 5 minutes." Sarah Chen, Sterling & Associates head of compliance and legal affairs, walked into his office carrying a manila folder that seemed to weigh more than its contents should have allowed. Sarah was 42 years old, a graduate of Harvard Law School, and possessed the kind of precise intelligence that had made her one of the most respected compliance officers on Wall Street. Marcus had always maintained a professional but distant relationship with her, viewing compliance as a necessary irritation rather than an essential safeguard. "Marcus, we need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her and moving toward his desk with the measured steps of someone carrying devastating news. Her usually warm demeanor had been replaced by the kind of professional coldness that preceded life-altering conversations. "Sarah, I'm extremely busy this morning. If this is about the Chen Industries documentation, I've already reviewed everything and it's completely in order." Marcus didn't look up from his computer screen, his fingers continuing to type as if her presence was merely a minor distraction. "This isn't about Chen Industries," Sarah replied, placing the manila folder on his desk with deliberate care. "The Securities and Exchange Commission has been investigating some of your recent transactions. They've issued subpoenas for all documentation related to the Meridian Holdings deal, the Pacific Rim merger, and the Coastal Development acquisition." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, causing him to stop typing and look up from his screen for the first time since she had entered the office. The Meridian Holdings deal had been his masterpiece, a complex financial instrument that had generated enormous profits for both Sterling and Associates and its clients. The Pacific Rim merger had been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine as an example of innovative international finance. The coastal development acquisition had been the foundation of his reputation as a financial alchemist. "That's impossible," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of authority he had learned to project when faced with challenges to his competence. "Every one of those deals was structured according to existing regulations. I personally reviewed every document, every filing, every disclosure." Sarah opened the manila folder and spread its contents across his desk. Copies of emails, trading records, bank transfers, and communication logs that painted a picture Marcus had never seen assembled in one place. "The investigation has been ongoing for 8 months. They have evidence of securities fraud, insider trading, and market manipulation spanning the last 3 years. As Marcus examined the documents, his memory began reconstructing the decisions and compromises that had led to this moment. For years, he had been pushing boundaries, cutting corners, and engaging in practices that danced dangerously close to the line of legality. In his arrogance and his obsession with maintaining his image of infallibility, he had convinced himself that rules were for smaller people, that his success gave him immunity from consequences, that his intelligence allowed him to operate in gray areas that others couldn't navigate. The manipulation had started small, using information from client conversations to guide his own investment decisions, structuring deals in ways that benefited him personally, while technically remaining within legal boundaries, creating financial instruments that were deliberately complex to hide their true risk profiles from investors. Each successful transgression had emboldened him to take larger risks, to cut deeper corners, to believe that his track record of success placed him above the regulations that governed ordinary financial professionals. "How long do I have?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper as the full implications of the investigation began to crystallize in his mind. "The FBI will be here tomorrow morning with search warrants," Sarah replied. "Sterling and Associates is cooperating fully with the investigation, which means we're required to provide all requested documentation and to suspend you immediately pending the outcome of the federal inquiry." The news broke like a dam bursting, flooding Marcus's carefully constructed world, with consequences he had spent years convincing himself would never arrive. Within 6 hours, his face was on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, with the headline, "Fall of the Alchemist. Federal Investigation Rocks Sterling and Associates." Within 12 hours, financial news networks were running segments about his case as an example of Wall Street excess and corruption. Within 18 hours, his photograph was being shown alongside those of other disgraced financial executives in a segment titled, "When Greed Goes Too Far." Sterling and Associates held an emergency board meeting and voted unanimously to terminate Marcus's employment effective immediately. The Securities and Exchange Commission froze all his assets pending the completion of their investigation. His bank accounts, his investment portfolios, his real estate holdings, and even his personal possessions were suddenly beyond his reach. Federal marshals arrived at his penthouse apartment with a court order, authorizing them to seize everything of value as potential evidence or assets that might need to be liquidated to pay fines and restitution. They inventoried his art collection, his designer clothing, his electronics, and even his wine cellar with the methodical efficiency of people who had performed this ritual many times before. The Maserati was repossessed by the finance company that had provided the loan. The penthouse was seized by federal agents. His credit cards were canceled by banks that no longer considered him a preferred customer. The luxury lifestyle that had taken him 15 years to build was dismantled in less than 48 hours. Vivian Ashworth disappeared from his life with the same sudden efficiency that characterized everything else about his downfall. She didn't return his phone calls, didn't respond to his text messages, and within a week was photographed at a charity gala on the arm of another wealthy financier, wearing a diamond necklace that Marcus recognized as one he had given her for her birthday. But the cruelest blow came from his own family, the people who had sacrificed and supported him throughout his rise to success. His parents, Eugene and Dorothy Thompson, who had been so proud of their son's achievements that they kept a scrapbook of every newspaper article that mentioned his name, couldn't bear the shame of what he had become. The phone call from his father came on a Thursday evening, as Marcus sat in a budget motel room in Queens, subsisting on takeout food and watching news coverage of his own downfall on a television with poor reception. "Marcus, your mother and we don't know what to say." His father's voice carried the weight of 33 years of honest labor, of playing by the rules, of believing that hard work and integrity would eventually be rewarded. "We raised you to be better than this. We taught you the difference between right and wrong. Dad, I know how this looks, but you have to understand the pressure I was under, the expectations, the competition." "No, son," his father interrupted, and Marcus could hear his mother crying in the background. "I worked on that assembly line for 33 years. 33 years of doing the same job every single day, following every rule, treating every person with respect, and never once taking something that didn't belong to me. Your mother served those children their lunch every day for 28 years, and she treated every single child like they were her own grandchild." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but Marcus understood within the first few exchanges that something fundamental had broken between him and the people who had given him life, and shaped his earliest understanding of right and wrong. His parents weren't angry as much as they were bewildered. How had the boy who used to help his grandmother count coupons become a man who stole from other people's grandmothers? "I don't know who you are anymore," his mother whispered through tears before hanging up the phone, and those words would echo in Marcus's mind for months afterward. As he sat alone in that motel room, staring at his reflection in a cracked mirror, Marcus began to realize that he had spent so many years becoming successful that he had forgotten how to be human. He had built his identity on being better than everyone else, on never showing weakness, on accumulating more and more evidence of his superiority, and now that foundation had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but the hollow shell of a man who had never learned the value of genuine humility. The investigation would take 8 more months to complete, during which time Marcus would discover depths of helplessness and hopelessness he never knew existed. But this was only the beginning of a journey that would strip away everything he thought he knew about strength, success, and what it truly means to be worthy of respect. The golden prison he had built around himself was finally cracking, and through those cracks, if he was brave enough to look, he might glimpse something that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to remember: the possibility of becoming genuinely human. 8 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in a line that stretched around the corner of Houston Street on Manhattan's Lower East Side, clutching a black garbage bag containing everything he owned in the world. The line was composed of men whose stories were written in the language of defeat, faces weathered by exposure to elements and substances, clothes that had been worn too long and washed too little, eyes that held the particular emptiness that comes from having hope systematically extracted over time. St. Joseph's Shelter occupied a converted warehouse that had once stored textiles for the garment industry. The building's red brick facade was marked by decades of neglect, its windows protected by metal grating that made it look more like a prison than a sanctuary. Above the entrance, a hand-painted sign read, "All are welcome," in English, Spanish, and what appeared to be Arabic, though the paint was fading and some letters had worn away completely. The criminal investigation had concluded with Marcus pleading guilty to multiple felony charges, including securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to manipulate financial markets. His cooperation with federal prosecutors had saved him from a lengthy prison sentence, but it hadn't saved his reputation, his freedom, or his sense of himself as someone who deserved better than this. He had received 3 years of supervised probation, 800 hours of community service, and a lifetime ban from working in the securities industry. More devastating than any legal punishment, however, was the complete destruction of his ability to see himself as someone worthy of respect or consideration. The few $1,000s he had managed to keep from his frozen assets were quickly exhausted by legal fees, basic survival expenses, and the crushing reality of trying to rebuild a life when your name had become synonymous with corporate corruption. Marcus discovered that finding employment as a convicted felon was nearly impossible, especially when your crime had been front-page news in every major financial publication in the country. The same media outlets that had once celebrated his rise now delighted in documenting his fall. Where are they now? Segments featured him as an example of justice served and karma delivered. Online comment sections filled with people who took satisfaction in seeing a wealthy man get what they believed he deserved. Marcus had applied for hundreds of jobs over the past 6 months: fast food restaurants, retail stores, delivery services, cleaning companies, day labor operations. The responses were uniformly negative. Most employers conducted background checks that immediately disqualified him. Others recognized his name from news coverage and decided they didn't want the publicity associated with hiring him. A few were willing to consider him until they learned about the specific nature of his crimes. Stealing money carried a stigma that other offenses didn't share. The man who had graduated summa cum laude from one of America's most prestigious business schools couldn't get a job sweeping floors at a warehouse in Brooklyn. The person who had once managed investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars was turned down for a position stocking shelves at a grocery store in Queens. St. Joseph's Shelter was his last option before the streets themselves, and even that option was temporary. The shelter had a maximum stay policy of 90 days, designed to prevent long-term dependency, while providing emergency assistance to people who were experiencing temporary setbacks. After 90 days, residents were expected to have found employment, housing, or alternative arrangements. The intake process was conducted by a social worker named David Martinez, a man in his 50s who had been working with homeless populations for over 20 years. David had seen every kind of person pass through these doors: veterans struggling with PTSD and addiction, families displaced by eviction or domestic violence, elderly people whose fixed incomes couldn't keep pace with rising rents, young adults who had aged out of foster care with no support systems. "Name?" David asked, his pen poised over a clipboard covered with forms that would reduce Marcus's life to a series of checkboxes and abbreviated responses. "Marcus Thompson." David looked up from his paperwork, his expression registering recognition. "You're the guy from the news, aren't you? The Wall Street guy?" Marcus nodded, bracing himself for judgment, ridicule, or rejection. Instead, David simply resumed writing. "Well, Mr. Thompson, you're here now, and that means you need help same as everyone else. We don't judge people based on their past mistakes. We try to help them figure out their next steps. Your bunk assignment is number 247, which is in the back section of the main dormitory. Lights out at 10 p.m., wake up at 6 a.m., breakfast is served from 6:30 to 8. The main dormitory was a cavernous space filled with 200 metal-framed beds arranged in neat rows. Each bed consisted of a thin mattress, a pillow that had been worn flat by countless heads, and a wool blanket that smelled of industrial detergent and human desperation. The space between beds was barely 2 feet, creating an environment where privacy was impossible, and personal space was a luxury that didn't exist. Marcus's neighbors included men from every conceivable background and circumstance. To his left was Roberto Martinez, a 43-year-old former construction worker who had injured his back on a job site, become addicted to prescription painkillers, and lost his apartment when his disability payments couldn't cover the rent. To his right was James Washington, a 22-year-old who had aged out of the foster care system and was working 2 part-time jobs while trying to save enough money for a security deposit on a room in a boarding house. The sounds of the dormitory at night were unlike anything Marcus had experienced during his years of luxury hotels and peaceful penthouses. Men coughed, snored, talked in their sleep, and moved restlessly on mattresses that provided little comfort. Some prayed quietly in languages he didn't recognize. Others wept with the kind of silent desperation that comes from crying when you don't want anyone to know you're crying. Marcus's first weeks at the shelter were marked by a desperate attempt to maintain his sense of superiority, even in these surroundings. He would lie on his narrow bunk, mentally rehearsing elaborate plans for his comeback, convinced that his intelligence and education would soon restore him to his rightful place in the world of finance and power. He looked down on his fellow residents, seeing them as weak individuals who had somehow deserved their fate through poor decisions, lack of ambition, or insufficient intelligence. He avoided conversations, participated minimally in communal activities, and maintained the emotional distance that had served him well in his previous life, but now only increased his isolation and misery. But pride, he began to discover, was a luxury he could no longer afford. When you're hungry enough, you learn to swallow more than just your food. When you're desperate enough, you begin to realize that your circumstances aren't temporary obstacles to overcome, but consequences you need to accept, understand, and learn from. The breaking point came on a bitter February evening when Marcus was assigned to kitchen duty alongside Eugene Washington, a 63-year-old Vietnam veteran who had been living on the streets for over 12 years. Eugene's hands were gnarled from arthritis and decades of manual labor. His face was weathered by exposure to elements that had aged him beyond his years, but his eyes held a kindness and wisdom that Marcus had rarely encountered in boardrooms or country clubs. Eugene had grown up in rural Alabama during the height of the civil rights movement, had been drafted into military service at age 19, and had served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam as a combat medic. He had returned home to a country that seemed to have little use for veterans, especially black veterans, and had struggled with alcohol addiction, unemployment, and the kinds of systemic barriers that made rebuilding a life nearly impossible. "You've been carrying yourself like you don't belong here," Eugene observed as they peeled potatoes side by side in the shelter's industrial kitchen. His voice was gentle but direct, carrying the authority of someone who had survived more hardships than most people could imagine. Marcus wanted to argue, to explain that he was different, that he was temporarily displaced rather than genuinely homeless, that his presence here was an aberration that would soon be corrected by the natural order of things. "But the truth is, son," Eugene continued, "we all belong wherever we find ourselves at any given moment. The question ain't how you got here, or whether you deserve to be here. The question is what you gonna learn while you're here, and how you gonna use that learning to become a better person than you were before." As they worked together preparing dinner for 200 men, Eugene shared stories of his life with a matter-of-fact acceptance that both humbled and confused Marcus. He spoke of growing up in poverty so profound that some nights his family went to bed hungry. He talked about watching his friends die in the jungles of Southeast Asia, about coming home to a country that treated him like he was dangerous rather than heroic, about losing his family to his own demons and addictions. But Eugene spoke without bitterness, self-pity, or resentment. His stories weren't complaints but observations, shared with the kind of philosophical acceptance that comes from having wrestled with the fundamental questions of existence and emerged with something resembling peace. "The hardest lesson I ever learned," Eugene said as they finished their kitchen duties and began cleaning up for the night, "was that being broke ain't the same thing as being broken. You can lose everything you own, your house, your car, your job, your reputation, and still keep everything you are. But you got to know the difference between what you have and who you are." That night, as Marcus lay on his narrow bunk, listening to the sounds of 200 men trying to find rest in circumstances that offered little comfort, he began to realize that his entire adult life had been built on a fundamental confusion. He had spent decades accumulating possessions, titles, and achievements, believing that these external markers defined his worth as a human being. But now, stripped of everything he had once considered important, he was forced to confront the terrifying question of who Marcus Thompson actually was, beneath all the trappings of success. The answer, he discovered, was both simple and devastating. He didn't know. For 35 years, he had been so focused on becoming someone important that he had never learned how to simply be someone good. He had confused confidence with arrogance, strength with cruelty, success with significance, and intelligence with wisdom. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Marcus began to observe the other men in the shelter with different eyes. He started to see intelligence in Roberto Martinez, who could calculate complex measurements in his head and knew more about structural engineering than most college graduates. He recognized resilience in James Washington, who worked 40 hours a week at 2 different jobs while studying for his GED, and never complained about the 18-hour days he was living. He began to understand that many of these men possessed qualities he had never developed: genuine empathy, born from personal suffering, selflessness learned through having nothing left to give but still giving anyway, the ability to find joy in moments so small that Marcus had never noticed them, and most importantly, the wisdom that comes from having nothing left to lose except your humanity. Eugene Washington became an informal mentor to Marcus, not through lectures or formal instruction, but through daily examples of how to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Eugene woke up every morning at 5:30 and spent 20 minutes in what he called gratitude meditation. Not formal prayer exactly, but a deliberate practice of acknowledging whatever positive elements existed in his current situation. "Every morning I wake up, I'm thankful for 5 things," Eugene explained one day, as they folded donated clothes in the shelter's clothing room. "Today, I'm thankful for this roof over my head, for the work we got to do with our hands, for the food we gonna eat later, for the fact that my body is healthy enough to serve other people, and for the conversations I get to have with folks like you who help me understand myself better." Marcus tried to adopt this practice but found it nearly impossible at first. His mind was so accustomed to focusing on what was wrong, what was missing, what needed to be fixed or improved, that deliberately acknowledging what was right felt like a foreign language he was trying to learn. But gradually, over weeks and then months, Marcus began to develop what Eugene called gratitude eyes, the ability to see abundance in circumstances that looked like scarcity, to find reasons for hope in situations that seemed hopeless, to recognize gifts in experiences that felt like punishments. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Thompson was learning what it meant to be humble, not as a strategy for achieving something else, but as a fundamental approach to living. He was discovering that true strength might not come from never falling down, but from how gracefully you learn to get back up. And in that graceful getting up, he was beginning to glimpse the possibility that his fall from grace might not have been a fall at all, but the first step in learning how to truly rise. Spring arrived in Manhattan like a tentative forgiveness, and with it came changes that Marcus couldn't yet see, but was beginning to feel in the subtle shifts of his daily existence at St. Joseph's Shelter. He had been living there for 6 months now, and the sharp edges of his former arrogance had been gradually worn smooth by the daily rituals of communal survival and the quiet wisdom of men who had nothing left to prove to anyone. The shelter's director, Father Michael O'Brien, had approached Marcus during his 3rd month with an opportunity that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his rebuilding life. Father O'Brien was a 72-year-old Jesuit priest who had spent 40 years working with homeless populations in New York City. He possessed the kind of practical spirituality that was more concerned with feeding bodies and housing souls than with theological abstractions. "Marcus," Father O'Brien had said one Tuesday morning as they shared coffee in the shelter's small administrative office, "I've been watching you work with some of the other men here, and I think you might have a gift for teaching. We've got a partnership with a nonprofit organization that runs adult education programs, and they're looking for someone to help with financial literacy classes." The suggestion had initially seemed absurd to Marcus. He was a convicted felon with a lifetime ban from the financial industry, living in a homeless shelter, and subsisting on donated meals and charity. What could he possibly teach anyone about managing money successfully? But Father O'Brien had a different perspective on Marcus's qualifications. "Son, you've seen both sides of the financial world now. You know what it looks like when money becomes an addiction, when success becomes a prison, when the pursuit of wealth destroys everything that actually makes life worth living. That's knowledge you can't get from textbooks or business school. That's wisdom that comes from having lived through the consequences of your choices." The organization was called Second Chances Education Initiative, and it was run by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a 38-year-old former corporate attorney who had walked away from a partnership track at one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms to dedicate her life to education and social justice. Elena operated her programs out of a converted classroom in the basement of St. Patrick's Cathedral, equipped with donated computers, mismatched desks, and walls covered with motivational posters that somehow managed to feel genuine rather than condescending. The space had the warm, slightly chaotic energy of a place where important learning was happening despite limited resources. Marcus's first meeting with Elena took place on a warm April afternoon that carried the scent of spring flowers and the promise of new beginnings. She was barely 5 feet tall, possessed enormous dark eyes that seemed to see through surface presentations to the essential truth of people, and had an energy that illuminated every room she entered. "Father O'Brien tells me you have a background in finance," she said as they sat across from each other at one of the classroom's small tables. "But more importantly, he says you have personal experience with financial failure. That combination could be incredibly valuable for the people we serve here." Elena's own story was a testament to the possibility of radical life transformation, driven by the pursuit of meaning rather than money. She had been earning $350,000 a year as a corporate attorney, living in a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side, when she realized that her work felt completely disconnected from any purpose she could respect or defend. "I spent my days helping wealthy corporations find legal ways to avoid paying taxes, while ordinary working families struggled to keep their homes," she explained as they walked through the classroom space. "I was very good at what I did, and I was making enormous amounts of money. But I went to bed every night feeling like I was living someone else's life." Her transformation had been gradual but decisive. She had started volunteering with adult literacy programs on weekends, then taken vacation days to spend more time teaching. Eventually, she realized that the few hours she spent each week in classrooms with adult learners were the only times she felt genuinely alive and useful. "The moment I decided to leave corporate law was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time," Elena continued. "I walked away from financial security, from social status, from everything I had worked toward for 15 years. But I also walked toward something that felt authentic for the first time in my adult life." Elena assigned Marcus to work with a group of 12 adults who met 3 evenings a week to learn basic financial literacy, budgeting skills, and strategies for rebuilding their economic lives after various setbacks. The group included people recovering from addiction, individuals who had experienced bankruptcy or foreclosure, former inmates trying to reintegrate into society, and others who had never learned fundamental money management skills. His first student was Maria Santos, a 34-year-old mother of 3, who was working to escape an abusive marriage while finishing her high school equivalency diploma. Maria had been financially dependent on her husband for 12 years and had never managed her own bank account, applied for credit, or made major purchasing decisions independently. "I don't understand any of this," Maria said during their initial tutoring session, gesturing at the basic budgeting worksheets that Elena had provided. "My husband always handled the money. He told me I was too stupid to understand numbers, and I believed him." Marcus looked at this brave woman who was working 2 part-time jobs while caring for 3 children under the age of 10, attending classes 4 nights a week, and trying to save enough money to afford her own apartment. And he realized that she possessed more practical intelligence and real-world competence than most of the executives he had worked with on Wall Street. "Maria," he said gently, "you're managing the lives and schedules of 3 children, coordinating multiple work schedules, budgeting household expenses on a very limited income, and pursuing your education at the same time. That requires the same skills that financial managers use. You're just applying them in a different context." Over the following weeks, as they worked together on creating budgets, understanding credit reports, and planning for financial goals, Marcus began to understand that teaching wasn't simply a matter of transferring information from one person to another. Real teaching required empathy, patience, and the ability to see potential in people that they might not yet see in themselves. Maria's progress was remarkable. Within 2 months, she had opened her own checking and savings accounts, established a budget that allowed her to save $50 a month toward her apartment fund, and begun the process of establishing her own credit history. More importantly, she had developed confidence in her ability to make financial decisions and plan for her family's future. Marcus's second student was Robert Chen, a 22-year-old man who had aged out of the foster care system and was struggling with basic literacy alongside financial planning. Robert had been living on the streets since he turned 18, supporting himself through a combination of odd jobs, temporary employment, and occasionally petty theft. Robert was suspicious of Marcus from their first meeting, his dark eyes filled with the wariness of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from the adults in his life. He had been failed by social workers, teachers, foster parents, and employers, and he approached their tutoring sessions with the defensive attitude of someone who was prepared to be abandoned or betrayed. "So you're the rich boy who got caught stealing," Robert said bluntly during their second session together. "What makes you think you can teach me anything about money when you couldn't even manage your own?" The comment stung because it contained enough truth to hurt, but Marcus recognized the challenge for what it was, a test of his character rather than an attack on his credentials. Instead of responding with defensiveness or condescension, he found himself being honest in a way that surprised them both. "You're absolutely right," Marcus admitted, setting down his pencil and looking directly at Robert. "I was a rich boy who got caught stealing. I spent 15 years thinking I was smarter than everyone else, and it turned out I was just better at fooling myself. I made every mistake it's possible to make with money, power, and success. I don't know what I can teach you, but I'd like to learn what you might be able to teach me." The response seemed to catch Robert off guard. He had been prepared for argument, defensiveness, or patronizing explanations, but not for genuine acknowledgement and curiosity. Over the following weeks, as they worked together on basic math skills and practical financial planning, Marcus began to understand the profound courage it took for someone like Robert to walk into that classroom every day. Here was a young man who had been failed by every system designed to protect him: family, foster care, education, employment. Yet he continued to show up, continued to try, continued to believe that learning something new might offer him a path to something better than the streets and survival jobs that had defined his existence since childhood. Robert's intelligence was evident in unexpected ways. He could calculate tips and percentages in his head faster than Marcus could with a calculator. He understood the economics of street survival with a sophistication that would have impressed business school professors. He had developed strategies for stretching $5 into 3 meals that demonstrated more practical financial skills than many wealthy people possessed. "The thing about being poor," Robert explained one evening as they worked on creating a savings plan based on his irregular income from day labor jobs, "is that you learn to think about money different than rich people do. Rich people think about growing money, making it multiply, using it to make more money. Poor people think about surviving money, making it last, stretching it until the next bit comes in." Marcus realized that Robert was describing two completely different financial philosophies, and that his own approach had been so focused on accumulation and growth that he had never developed the survival skills that Robert had mastered out of necessity. Elena watched these interactions between Marcus and his students with the keen eye of someone who understood that education was about far more than transferring information. She began to see in Marcus the raw materials of something valuable: intelligence tempered by humility, ambition redirected toward service, and the kind of authentic vulnerability that came from having lost everything and survived to tell about it. One evening in late May, after the last student had left the program, and they were cleaning up the classroom for the night, Elena asked Marcus to stay behind for a conversation that would fundamentally change his understanding of his own potential. "I've been watching you work with Maria and Robert and the other students," she said, settling into one of the classroom's mismatched chairs and gesturing for him to sit across from her. "You have a gift for connecting with people, for making complex ideas accessible, for seeing potential in students that they don't yet see in themselves. Have you ever considered becoming a teacher professionally?" Marcus almost laughed at the suggestion, but caught himself when he saw that Elena was completely serious. "I'm a convicted felon with a lifetime ban from the securities industry. No school district in America would hire me to teach children. And what adult education program would want someone with my background representing their organization?" "Maybe not in a traditional sense," Elena acknowledged, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had seen possibilities that weren't yet visible to others. "But there are other ways to teach, other populations that desperately need what you have to offer. The question isn't whether traditional institutions would accept you. The question is whether you're ready to let go of who you used to be and embrace who you might become." Over the following months, Elena became both a mentor and a friend to Marcus in ways that transcended their professional relationship. She challenged him to think beyond his immediate circumstances of shelter living and court-mandated community service, to consider how his experiences, both his successes and his spectacular failures, might serve a larger purpose in the world. She introduced him to other people who had rebuilt their lives after devastating setbacks and discovered that their struggles had prepared them for forms of service they never could have imagined during their previous incarnations. There was David Martinez, a former gang member who now worked as a youth counselor in the Bronx, helping teenagers navigate the same choices that had once led him to prison. There was Sarah Wilson, a recovered drug addict who had become a social worker specializing in addiction recovery, using her own experience of desperation and healing to guide others through their darkest moments. Elena also shared stories from her own law firm colleagues who had made similar transitions from corporate success to service-oriented careers. Some had become public defenders, using their legal skills to represent people who couldn't afford private attorneys. Others had joined nonprofit organizations focused on civil rights, environmental protection, or economic justice. A few had started their own organizations addressing problems they had discovered through their personal experiences. The funny thing about success, Elena told Marcus one evening as they organized donated textbooks and school supplies, is that you don't really understand it until you stop chasing it for its own sake. Real success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you contribute. It's not about being better than other people. It's about making other people better than they thought they could be. Under Elena's guidance, Marcus began to develop a new vision for his future that extended far beyond simply finding employment and stable housing. He started taking night classes toward a teaching certification, focusing on adult education and financial literacy instruction. He discovered that his years in finance, combined with his recent experiences of financial devastation, gave him a unique perspective on money management that resonated powerfully with people who were struggling economically. The coursework was challenging in ways that his MBA program had never been. Instead of focusing on abstract theories and competitive strategies, he was learning about human psychology, learning differences, trauma-informed teaching practices, and the complex factors that influenced adult motivation and success. His professors were initially skeptical of his background and motivations. Several questioned whether someone with his criminal history could be trusted to work with vulnerable populations. But his performance in classes and his obvious commitment to the work gradually won over even the most doubtful faculty members. More importantly, Marcus began to understand that his fall from grace hadn't been a punishment, but a preparation. Every moment of humiliation in that courtroom, every day of uncertainty about where he would sleep or what he would eat, every night spent wondering if he would ever feel valuable again. These experiences had been teaching him empathy, resilience, and the kind of authentic wisdom that could only be earned through suffering. He realized that the man he had been before, arrogant, disconnected, focused solely on personal advancement, could never have truly helped the people he was now serving. His former success had been built on a foundation of competition and superiority, but his new purpose was emerging from a foundation of compassion and shared struggle. Marcus started keeping a journal during this period, documenting not just his daily activities, but his evolving understanding of what it meant to build a meaningful life. The entries from this time reveal a man grappling with fundamental questions about purpose, service, and the relationship between personal fulfillment and contribution to others. I used to think that helping other people was something you did with your spare time and extra money, he wrote in one entry. Now I'm beginning to understand that helping other people might actually be the whole point. Everything else, the money, the status, the achievements, might just be tools that either support that central purpose or distract from it. As summer approached, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about the future. Not because he was planning to reclaim his former status or rebuild his previous lifestyle, but because he was beginning to discover who he might become if he allowed humility and service to guide his choices rather than pride and ambition. The teacher had arrived in his life when he least expected it and most needed it. But perhaps more importantly, the teacher was beginning to emerge from within him as well. Elena had shown him that education was ultimately about transformation, not just of students, but of teachers who were brave enough to let their students change them in return. And Marcus Thompson, who had once believed that learning was about accumulating information and credentials, was discovering that real learning was about becoming the kind of person who could help others discover their own hidden potential. The most important lessons he was learning were still ahead of him. 2 years after losing everything he thought he valued, Marcus Thompson stood in front of a classroom filled with 32 adults who were working to earn their general education development certificates, while simultaneously navigating the complex challenges of homelessness, addiction recovery, domestic violence escape, and the countless other obstacles that had brought them to this converted community center in the South Bronx. The classroom was located on the second floor of a building that had once housed a textile factory during the height of New York's manufacturing era. The windows looked out over a neighborhood that bore the scars of economic disinvestment, but also showed signs of renewal. Community gardens growing in vacant lots, murals celebrating local culture and history, small businesses owned by families who had decided to build something beautiful in a place that others had abandoned. Marcus was now teaching a comprehensive course called Financial Literacy and Life Planning, designed to help people understand not just basic money management, but the complex relationships between education, employment, housing, healthcare, and economic stability. The curriculum had been developed through his partnership with Elena Rodriguez and had been adopted by adult education programs in 4 other cities. But this wasn't just about redemption or paying back a debt to society. Marcus had discovered that teaching wasn't simply what he did for work. It was who he had become, who he was meant to become, perhaps who he had always been underneath all the layers of ambition and ego that had obscured his true nature for so many years. His students came from every conceivable background, each carrying their own story of setbacks and struggles, but also their own forms of wisdom, resilience, and determination. There was Maria Santos, who had completed her GED 8 months earlier, and was now enrolled in a community college nursing program while working as a domestic violence counselor. Her 3 children, who had initially been shy and withdrawn, now spoke confidently about their college plans and career dreams. There was Robert Chen, the young man who had aged out of foster care and initially challenged Marcus's qualifications to teach anyone about financial responsibility. Robert had not only earned his GED, but had started a small moving company with 2 other program graduates, employing people who were transitioning out of homelessness and providing them with both work and mentorship. Angela Washington, the 60-year-old woman who had never learned to read properly, had not only mastered literacy, but had written and self-published a memoir about growing up in the rural South during the civil rights era. She was now working on a children's book about the importance of education and perseverance, and had been invited to speak at several schools about her journey from illiteracy to authorship. Each success story represented hundreds of hours of work, countless moments of frustration and breakthrough, and the kind of incremental progress that rarely made headlines but changed lives in profound and lasting ways. Marcus had learned to measure success not in terms of dramatic transformations, but in terms of steady growth, increased confidence, and expanded possibilities. The curriculum he taught had evolved far beyond basic financial concepts to include what he called life systems thinking, understanding how different aspects of adult life interconnected and influenced each other. Students learned about budgeting and saving, but they also learned about workplace rights, healthcare navigation, housing law, educational opportunities, and the importance of building supportive communities. Elena Rodriguez had helped Marcus secure this position through Second Chance's education initiative, which had grown from a small program operating out of church basements to a citywide organization serving over 800 adult learners annually. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover rent on a 1-bedroom apartment in Washington Heights, but Marcus had learned to measure wealth in terms far different from his previous calculations. His relationship with money had been completely transformed by his experiences of having nothing and slowly building something meaningful from that foundation. Where he had once seen financial resources as tools for accumulation and status display, he now understood them as means for security, service, and the creation of opportunities for other people. He lived simply but comfortably, saving methodically not for luxury purchases, but for emergencies and future educational opportunities. He found genuine joy in small experiences that had once been beneath his notice. An excellent book from the neighborhood library, a perfect cup of coffee from the Dominican restaurant downstairs from his apartment, dinner with friends at places where the owners knew everyone's names and asked about their families. The real transformation, however, was happening not in his bank account, but in his character and his understanding of what it meant to be a successful human being. The man who had once fired employees without a second thought now spent hours after class, helping students navigate personal crises that threatened their educational progress. Marcus had also begun working as a volunteer financial counselor for people recovering from addiction, bankruptcy, and other major life disruptions. His own experience of financial ruin gave him credibility with clients who might otherwise be suspicious of traditional financial advisors who had never experienced real economic desperation. He understood intimately the shame, fear, and confusion that came with losing everything you thought you needed to be happy. He could speak to these experiences with authenticity rather than theoretical knowledge, and he could help people develop the practical skills and emotional resilience needed to rebuild their lives on more solid foundations. One evening in late October, as autumn painted the Bronx in shades of gold and orange, Marcus received a phone call that would test everything he had learned about humility, forgiveness, and the nature of true success. His former boss at Sterling & Associates, Richard Sterling himself, was on the other end of the line. "Marcus, I hope I'm not intruding by calling you directly." Sterling's familiar voice carried notes of uncertainty and something that might have been respect. "I've been following your work with adult education programs, and I wanted to reach out about a consulting opportunity that I think might interest you." Richard Sterling was 72 years old, had built Sterling & Associates into one of the most successful investment firms on Wall Street, and had weathered the scandal of Marcus's criminal charges with his reputation largely intact. But the firm had faced increased scrutiny from regulators, and had been required to implement comprehensive compliance and ethics programs designed to prevent future violations. "The firm has been developing new training programs focused on ethical decision-making and compliance culture," Sterling continued. "We're looking for someone to help design and implement these programs, someone who understands both the pressures that can lead to ethical violations and the personal consequences of crossing those lines. Your background gives you unique qualifications for this kind of work." The offer was generous. A 6-figure consulting contract for 8 months of work, helping to design training programs, compliance procedures, and cultural change initiatives. It was also an opportunity to return to the financial world, to reclaim some measure of his former status and earning potential, and to work again with the kinds of sophisticated financial instruments and strategies that had once defined his professional identity. 2 years earlier, Marcus would have accepted such an opportunity immediately and without reservation. But now, as he sat in his modest apartment surrounded by student essays he was grading and lesson plans he was developing, he found himself thinking carefully about what this choice would represent and what it might cost. He thought about Maria Santos, who had just received her acceptance letter to nursing school and was planning to specialize in trauma care for domestic violence survivors. He considered Robert Chen, whose moving company had hired its 5th employee and was developing a training program for other young people transitioning out of foster care. He reflected on Angela Washington, whose memoir had been reviewed positively in several literary magazines and who was scheduled to read excerpts at a community event next week. These people had trusted him with their dreams, their vulnerabilities, and their hopes for better futures. They had allowed him to be part of their journeys toward lives of greater dignity and possibility, and in doing so, they had given him something more valuable than any corporate position could offer, a sense of purpose that aligned with his deepest values and his emerging understanding of what it meant to be genuinely successful. Marcus also thought about Elena Rodriguez, who had shown him that real leadership meant serving others rather than commanding them. He considered Father O'Brien, who had demonstrated that true authority came from meeting people where they were, rather than demanding that they rise to where you thought they should be. He reflected on Eugene Washington from The Shelter, whose quiet wisdom had taught him that strength came from accepting reality, rather than trying to manipulate it. Marcus called Sterling back the next morning with his answer, delivered in a voice that was calm, confident, and completely certain. "Richard, I'm deeply honored that you would think of me for this position, and I believe the work you're describing is important and necessary. However, my life has taken a different direction, and I've found my place doing work that feels more meaningful and sustainable for me personally. But I'd be happy to recommend some colleagues who would be excellent for this kind of consulting." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Sterling expressing surprise but also a kind of grudging respect for Marcus's decision. The old Marcus Thompson would never have turned down such an opportunity for financial and professional rehabilitation, and both men understood the significance of the choice he was making. But the old Marcus Thompson had been a man driven by insecurity, disguised as confidence, constantly trying to prove his worth through external achievements and competitive victories. The new Marcus had learned that true worth came from contribution rather than accumulation, from service rather than status, from lifting others up rather than climbing over them to reach higher positions. As winter approached, Marcus began working on a book about financial recovery and personal transformation. He wanted to share what he had learned about rebuilding a life after devastating failure, about finding meaning in loss, and about the surprising strength that came from accepting your own vulnerability and using it to connect with others who were struggling. The book, tentatively titled Broken Unbroken, A Wall Street Exile's Guide to Real Wealth, was part memoir, part practical guide, and part philosophical exploration of what it meant to live a truly successful life. He worked on it in the early morning hours before class and on weekends, writing in coffee shops and libraries, interviewing other people who had rebuilt their lives after major setbacks. The writing process forced him to examine his experiences with the kind of honesty that was both painful and liberating. He had to confront not just his crimes and their consequences, but the deeper character flaws that had made those crimes possible. His arrogance, his disconnection from other people's experiences, his confusion of wealth with worth, and his belief that success justified any means used to achieve it. But he also had to acknowledge the growth that had emerged from his failures. The man who had once believed that humility was weakness had discovered that it was actually the foundation of every meaningful form of strength. He had learned that rising from the bottom wasn't about returning to where you had been before, but about becoming someone worthy of the journey you had traveled. Marcus's students began to notice changes in his teaching as he worked on the book. His lessons became more personal, more connected to real experiences of struggle and recovery. He shared more of his own story, not as confessional self-indulgence, but as illustration of the principles he was trying to teach. "I used to think that admitting mistakes was a sign of weakness," he told his Thursday evening class as they discussed the importance of honest self-assessment in financial planning. "I thought that successful people were people who never failed, who always made the right choices, who somehow avoided the problems that other people faced. Now I understand that successful people are people who fail, learn from their failures, and use what they've learned to help other people avoid similar mistakes." The response from students was powerful and immediate. They began sharing their own stories of failure and recovery with more openness, supporting each other through setbacks, and celebrating victories that might seem small to outside observers, but represented major achievements for people who were rebuilding their lives from nothing. Marcus realized that he had stumbled onto something that traditional education often missed: the power of authentic vulnerability to create connections that made real learning possible. When teachers were willing to acknowledge their own struggles and failures, students felt permission to do the same, and that honesty created the foundation for genuine growth and transformation. As his second year of teaching concluded, Marcus received news that would validate everything he had learned about the relationship between service and success. The Second Chances Education Initiative had received a major federal grant to expand their programs nationwide, and Marcus had been selected to serve as the National Program Director, overseeing curriculum development and teacher training in 12 cities. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, but more importantly, it represented recognition that his work was making a measurable difference in people's lives. The program's success rates were among the highest in the country for adult education initiatives, with over 70% of graduates finding stable employment or pursuing further education within 6 months of completion. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, who was now in her second year of nursing school, stopped by his classroom one evening after her clinical rotation at a local hospital. "Mr. Thompson, I wanted to thank you for something," she said, her voice carrying the confidence that had developed as she discovered her own capabilities. "Not just for helping me learn about budgeting and financial planning, but for helping me understand that I was already smart, already capable, already worthy of respect. You didn't make me intelligent. You helped me recognize the intelligence I already had." As Marcus walked home through the streets of Washington Heights that evening, he reflected on how completely his understanding of success had changed. The man who had once measured his worth through comparison with others now found fulfillment in helping others discover their own potential. The person who had built his identity on being superior to everyone around him now found peace in being useful to people who were working to improve their lives. He had learned that true success wasn't about reaching the top of some external hierarchy, but about becoming the kind of person who could help others climb toward their own versions of success. And in that helping, in that humble service to people who were struggling to build better lives, Marcus Thompson had found something more valuable than any fortune he had ever imagined. A life worthy of genuine respect, built on a foundation that could never be taken away because it was based on what he could give, rather than what he could get. 3.5 years after his world collapsed in a cascade of federal investigations and criminal charges, Marcus Thompson walked through the doors of the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center in Manhattan. But this time he wasn't there as a high-powered executive making deals or a disgraced felon serving community service. He was there as the keynote speaker for the National Adult Education Conference, invited to address over 3,000 educators, administrators, and community leaders from across the United States and several international delegations. The man who had once commanded attention through wealth, intimidation, and the projection of superiority now held audiences through authenticity, vulnerability, and wisdom that had been earned through genuine struggle and service. His keynote address, titled "The Curriculum of Catastrophe: What Failure Teaches About Success," would be broadcast live to education professionals in 47 states and archived for future training programs. Marcus stood backstage, adjusting the navy blue suit he had purchased at a department store in Washington Heights, rather than having custom tailored by the Italian craftsman who had once known his measurements by heart. His hands weren't shaking with nervousness, but trembling with excitement about the opportunity to share his story with people who dedicated their professional lives to helping others overcome obstacles and achieve their potential. The past 18 months had brought changes that Marcus could never have imagined during his darkest days at St. Joseph's Shelter. His book, Broken Unbroken: A Wall Street Exile's Guide to Real Wealth, had been published by a respected small press and was gaining attention from readers across the country who were struggling with their own financial and personal crises. The book had started as a personal project, a way for Marcus to process his experiences and organize the lessons he had learned about rebuilding a life after devastating failure. But it had evolved into something larger, a comprehensive guide that combined practical financial advice with deeper insights about character, relationships, and the pursuit of meaningful success. The advance had been modest, barely enough to cover his expenses during the 6 months he took off from teaching to complete the manuscript. But the response from readers had been overwhelming. Letters arrived weekly from people who had used his strategies to escape bankruptcy, rebuild their credit, find stable employment, or simply develop a healthier relationship with money and material success. More importantly, the nonprofit organization where Marcus worked had received a major federal grant to develop a nationwide curriculum based on the success of his financial literacy programs. The Department of Education had designated Second Chances Education Initiative as a model program for adult education, and Marcus had been promoted to National Program Director, overseeing a team of 47 educators across 12 states. The work was challenging in ways that his previous career had never been. Instead of managing investment portfolios and corporate acquisitions, he was now coordinating between community colleges, social service agencies, workforce development programs, and adult education centers. Instead of analyzing market trends and financial instruments, he was studying learning theory, trauma-informed pedagogy, and the complex factors that influenced adult motivation and success. But the challenges felt meaningful in ways that his former work never had. Every program he developed had the potential to change lives in concrete, measurable ways. Every training session he conducted for new instructors meant that more adults would have access to the kind of education and support that could help them build more stable, fulfilling lives. Elena Rodriguez, who had become not just a mentor but one of his closest friends and professional partners, introduced him that morning at the convention. As she spoke about his transformation from a man who thought he knew everything to a person who understood the value of knowing nothing, Marcus reflected on how completely his relationship with success, failure, and human worth had evolved. The old Marcus had measured success through comparison, being richer, smarter, more powerful, or more prestigious than others. Success was a zero-sum game where his victory required someone else's defeat, where his rise necessitated someone else's fall. The new Marcus understood success as contribution, how many people he could help, how much positive impact he could create, how deeply he could connect with the experiences of others who were working to improve their circumstances. His keynote address began with the story of that March morning 4 years earlier, when he had stood on the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building, believing he had conquered the world, and that his wealth and position made him superior to the ordinary people whose lives and struggles were invisible to him from that height. "I spent 15 years climbing what I thought was a ladder to success," he told the audience, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast convention hall, only to discover I had been climbing a ladder to isolation. Every rung I climbed took me further away from the people I was supposed to be serving, and closer to a version of myself that I ultimately couldn't respect or sustain. He spoke honestly about his crimes, his arrogance, and the devastating consequences of living a life disconnected from humility, empathy, and genuine service to others. But he also spoke about the unexpected gifts that had emerged from his failures, the discovery of his capacity for teaching, the development of authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy, and the profound satisfaction that came from helping others achieve their goals rather than simply advancing his own agenda. Marcus shared detailed stories about his students, Maria Santos, who had completed her nursing program with honors and was now working in a trauma unit while pursuing a master's degree in counseling psychology, specializing in domestic violence recovery. Her 3 children, who had once been quiet and withdrawn, were now honor students who spoke confidently about their college plans and professional dreams. He talked about Robert Chen, whose moving company had grown to employ 12 people, all of whom were individuals transitioning out of homelessness, foster care, or other difficult circumstances. Robert had developed a comprehensive training program that combined practical job skills with financial literacy, life planning, and peer mentorship. The company had been featured in several business publications as an example of social entrepreneurship that created both profit and positive social impact. He described Angela Washington's journey from illiteracy to authorship, culminating in her memoir being selected for inclusion in several college curricula as an example of American resilience and the power of education to transform lives. Angela was now working on her second book and had been invited to speak at universities, libraries, and community organizations across the country. "These people taught me that real strength isn't about never falling down," Marcus explained to the rapt audience. "It's about getting back up with more wisdom, more compassion, and more commitment to helping others than you had before you fell. They showed me that humility isn't the opposite of confidence. It's the foundation of the only kind of confidence that actually matters. The audience response was powerful and immediate. During the extended question and answer session that followed, educators shared their own stories of working with students who had faced devastating setbacks, and Marcus listened to accounts of people who had overcome addiction, abuse, poverty, discrimination, and trauma to build meaningful, productive lives. He was reminded again of the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of education when it was delivered with genuine respect for students' experiences, intelligence, and potential. The questions from the audience revealed the depth of commitment that educators brought to their work and the challenges they faced in systems that were often under-resourced and underappreciated. After the conference concluded, Marcus took the subway back to his apartment in Washington Heights, a journey that gave him time to reflect on how profoundly his relationship with New York City had changed. Where he had once seen Manhattan as a battlefield to be conquered, a collection of opportunities to be exploited, and a stage for displaying his wealth and power, he now saw it as a community to be served. The homeless people he passed on the street weren't invisible obstacles or reminders of failure to be avoided, but potential students, neighbors, and friends who might benefit from the programs he was helping to develop. The struggling families in his neighborhood weren't examples of people who hadn't worked hard enough or made smart enough choices, but individuals dealing with systemic challenges that required both personal resilience and community support to overcome. That evening, Marcus called his parents in Detroit for their weekly conversation. His relationship with Eugene and Dorothy Thompson had been slowly healing over the past 3 years, beginning with tentative birthday phone calls and gradually developing into regular communication and mutual respect. His mother had been the first to reach out, calling him on his 37th birthday with a tentative, "I've been thinking about you and praying for you every day." His father had taken longer to come around, but the man who had worked 33 years in an auto plant understood the value of honest labor, genuine transformation, and service to others. "I watched your speech online today," his father said, and Marcus could hear the pride and love in his voice. "Your mother and I are proud of the man you've become, son. Not because of what you've accomplished, but because of who you are now. You remind me of the boy who used to help your grandmother count coupons and never made her feel ashamed about needing to use them." The conversation lasted over an hour, with his parents sharing updates about their retirement, their health, their involvement in community activities, and their plans to visit him in New York the following month. It would be their first trip to the city since his arrest, and Marcus was looking forward to showing them not the penthouse and expensive restaurants of his former life, but the community center where he taught, the neighborhood where he had learned what home actually meant, and the colleagues who had become his chosen family. As he prepared for bed that night, Marcus opened his laptop to review emails from readers of his book and participants in the programs he supervised. There was a message from a woman in Oregon who had used his financial planning strategies to escape bankruptcy and was now starting her own small business. Another from a man in Texas who had been inspired by his story to return to school after losing his business in the economic downturn, and was now working as a financial counselor for other small business owners. There was an email from a teacher in Florida who wanted to adapt his curriculum for her adult education program, and another from a formerly homeless veteran in California who had used the job training and life skills components of the program to find stable employment and housing. Each message was a reminder that his greatest failure had led to his most meaningful success, and that the work he was doing now had the potential to create positive change in ways that his previous career never could have achieved. Marcus closed his laptop and prepared for sleep with a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. Not gratitude that his ordeal was over, but gratitude that it had happened at all, because without losing everything he thought he valued, he never would have discovered what truly mattered. Without being humbled by circumstances beyond his control, he never would have learned the strength that came from lifting others up rather than climbing over them. His journey from the 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building to a one-bedroom apartment in Washington Heights hadn't been a fall at all. It had been a coming home to the person he was always meant to become, a person whose worth was measured not by what he could acquire for himself, but by what he could give to others who were working to build better lives. The boy from Detroit who had once helped his grandmother count coupons had finally grown into a man who understood that true wealth wasn't what you accumulated in bank accounts or investment portfolios, but what you shared through teaching, mentorship, and service to others who needed support and encouragement. And in that sharing, in that humble dedication to helping others discover their own potential and worth, Marcus Thompson had found something more valuable than any fortune he had ever imagined. A life worthy of genuine respect, built on a foundation of character and contribution that could never be taken away, because it was based on what he could give rather than what he could get. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to serve. And Marcus Thompson, no longer humbled by circumstances beyond his control but humbled by choice and commitment to something larger than himself, would meet each day with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned that the only way to truly rise was to dedicate yourself to lifting others as you climb toward your own highest potential. The circle was complete, but the work was just beginning.